Hey everybody, welcome into our second ever Ask Me Anything for the City of Minot 2023 budget. Today we're answering your questions about the proposed budget for the next year with an emphasis on general government. Now, if you missed our first Q&A, you can find that one right here on this social media page. It was posted on Wednesday. It was all about public safety. We had a good conversation with both the police chief and the fire chief. I implore you to go check that out to get all caught up. My name, Derek Hackett. In case you're not familiar, I am the Public Information Officer with the city, and joining me on our journey of information today is City Manager Harold Stewart. Good afternoon, Harold.
Good afternoon.
And our Finance Director, David Lakefield, is joining us as well. Hey, Dave.
Good afternoon.
All right, everyone, here's what you want to expect for this. You can drop a question into the comments of this stream, and depending on time, and the volume, we'll do our very best to answer these questions. And we want you to keep them geared towards general government. You know, things that aren't public works, streets, police, and fire, everything else, if you have any questions about the 2023 budget. We're planning on about a max of 45 minutes today, and depending on the questions, this might be 20 minutes. Now, without further ado, I think we should just kind of jump into this and get the conversation started. And we'll start with you, Harold, as the city manager. When you proposed this budget to the city council, what is almost 2 weeks ago, it included a mill levy increase of 1.48 mils, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, shy of about $500,000 or so. What are some of the items in this budget that can that are attributing to that increase?
So there's several factors of that, and one, I want to preface this by saying that we're kind of coming towards the tail end of a pretty long process over several months, which started with staff preparing for the budget, assessing what their needs are, what the cost of those potential needs would be, making those requests. We followed that up with taking the city council out to each of the departments, doing some tours so they could see and hear specifically the needs and the challenges across the organization. And then we followed that up with a prioritization session with the city council in about June, I believe, if I remember correctly, where they had an opportunity to take all that information and then give the city staff some guidance and some priorities. And one of the conversations we had during that meeting was specific to what was the council's wishes with regards to the mill levy. Should we, do they think that we needed to increase it a little bit? Do they think we should keep it flat? Do they think that we should decrease it? And the direction from the council at that time was like to keep it as flat as possible, but we do understand the pressures that are coming with inflation and supply chain issues and those kinds of things, and giving some of the goals and the objectives that they established so that they, under the right circumstances, if a mill levy was increased, a small, modest increase would potentially be considered. So this budget was prepared in a way that preserve that option for the council, that if they wanted to do a small budget increase affecting the mill levy, they could. But some of the key highlights to answer your question that are included in this that resulted in my recommendation of the 1.48 mil increase is just due to some of the needs that we have coming on that are adding some additional costs that we haven't had in previous years. So we have two new major facilities that the city will be owning and operating coming online in 2023, that being Fire Station 5. Well, there was a whole lot of good to build the building and then have nobody that can respond out of that structure. So we have 3 new firefighter positions that are in this year's budget that are new positions and new asks to staff that. And then we also have the new City Hall downtown that's coming online. And the impact on that as far as personnel needs isn't super great, but we do want to make sure that we properly maintain that. So we had a few different property maintenance positions that have been included in the budgets. One was included last year in our current fiscal year budget this year. And then we had 2 positions that were recommended in my budget for fiscal year 23 to make sure that we have the right personnel to maintain that. In addition, like many of the businesses and the citizens, we're seeing increases in costs and things, big ones being fuel costs. I think we've probably doubled our fuel budgets. I believe in 2022 when we were preparing the numbers for that budget, I think we're just a little over like $2.50 a gallon. This time we're budgeting anywhere from $5 to $6 a gallon, depending on whether it's regular or diesel fuel. So we've seen substantial increases in that, and increases in utility costs like electric, natural gas, those kinds of things. We are also bringing on these 2 new facilities, which will have utility needs. So building all that in, it's not business as usual necessarily for the city. And so I think this budget is, while it does have a recommended 1.48 mil increase with all the challenges and the new things we're bringing on, I thought that was a pretty conservative ask of the 1.48 mil increase. Plus, when I presented to the council Monday, there is still some surplus there. I think it's only the second time in my career that I've come back to the city council and said, we've achieved all of your goals and priorities within the budget. Staff has what they feel they need to operate for the next 12 months. And there's still a little bit of money left over. What do you think is the best use or investment of this, or what do you want to do with it? It's only the second time in my career doing this for almost 2 decades now that I've been able to do that. So I think it's a reasonable and a conservative ask at this point with all the pressures that we're having, but ultimately it'll be up for the council. But and there is the possibility that if the council desires, they can choose to keep the mill levy flat or even decrease it if they choose. And we can still make a majority of that budget work. We did have a nice surprise here at the last minute with, we had built into the budget a 10% increase in health insurance for paying employee health insurance premiums, and ended up being that that weekend right before we presented to the council that we got information from our health insurance providers with the new estimates, and we weren't going to need that full 10%. So again, I think it's a good balanced budget. It's a progressive budget. It balances making progress on significant projects within the community, as well as strengthening the organization that we can provide better services in a more efficient manner. And anyway, so a lot of factors go into that recommendation.
I have a question that just came in via Facebook. Now, this one I'll read verbatim. We all know that there are new costs to the city, but are there areas that have been actually reduced from 22 to 23 in the current budget draft that we're working from here?
We did consider those factors as well. Probably one of the big ones, although it's still currently in the budget pending council decision, and that is we currently employ and provide service for doing electrical inspections across the city. The state has the ability with electrical inspectors. There's only, to my knowledge, maybe 4 communities in the state of North Dakota that do electrical inspections on their own. All the rest of North Dakota has that done through the state electrical board. And so we did present to the council the option of no longer funding those 2 positions, not knowing what the council decided, because there was some concerns when we talked about this at the council meeting. There was some concern by some of the council members about a reduction in service with regards to that, and they were kind of on the fence about whether or not they wanted to do that. But that is an item that we looked at, and that would be a savings of about $190,000 a year to the community of Minot if we transition that over to the state as opposed to doing it with us. We're always looking at being reasonable with special projects or replacement of equipment or vehicles and those kinds of things. We try to make sure that we're getting as much lifespan as we can out of those, or making sure that we're waiting to do those projects when they're really needed. And I do believe here, after this budget is approved, staff will get right into, again, how do we find more ways to be more efficient and more effective? And actually, that's one of the reasons why I requested the assistant city manager position be created, because I think that'll be a position that'll be important for helping us identify better efficiency and cost sharing across the different departments, if that's approved as well.
Let's keep going on this assistant city manager position, because this is something that has been asked a couple times in various different ways. This in 2023, it looks like we're adding 23 new FTEs, 14 of them against the property tax of the mill levy. And one that people ask about the most would be the assistant city manager or the public outreach position. Why are those two positions priorities in 2023's budget?
Let me deal with the public outreach officer position first. So one, that was a position that was requested by the police chief and the fire chief last year as part of the budget process. And we chose not to do it during that time. This year, it was the number one priority. So the police chief did ask, I want to say it was about 9 new positions to be considered in the budget this year, and that was his number one priority. He prioritized those requests for us as well. That was the number one. And I think a lot of that goes back to the community survey results that we had. We identified that public connection and outreach across the entire city organization as needing improvement, and in particular in public safety. And so I think that's why that position has been a priority, trying to get more information out, more timely, better engagement, better trust of the community with regards to public safety through social media or other avenues. That's why that position was a priority. That's a combination, again, of the results of the community survey as well as the recommendations of the police chief as far as what he sees as the highest needs for his department and organization, as well as the fire chief also, who has similar needs in that same area. When it comes to assistant city manager position, again, over the years, we keep heaping on more and more workload and more services that the community needs and expects from us to provide, and haven't really added a whole lot of positions through that. Our public works department is very big. We have many, sub departments that fall underneath public works, and it's getting to the point that it's so big that it's becoming difficult to manage and maybe not as efficient as it could be. So I think put in a high-level executive manager, assistant city manager over that will help do that. My days are pretty busy. I'm not making excuses, but my days are pretty busy, and I'm involved in a lot of meetings, and I don't always have the time to delve in and look at things to the degree that would be helpful before we make important decisions. And I think by creating this assistant city manager position, that will provide some more executive management level time to look at that. This is also a position that since I first stepped in as the city manager, as the new city manager for Minot, I've had staff and city council members tell me and advise me that they felt that an assistant city manager position was needed, and asked that I look at and consider that. So I've taken the last year and a half of being here as a new assistant city manager, or as the new city manager, to look at what my thought and opinion was as far as whether or not the organization needed it or not, or whether we could function in a different way. And over the last year and a half, I've become convinced that this is, if we're going to perform at a higher level as an organization, this position will be key in helping us do that. Especially as we're looking at, the landscape is shifting and changing after COVID, and the generational change from the baby boomers to the next generations. And we as an organization need to adapt, which means we need to take some serious deep dives and a serious look at our organization and how we do business. But that also means I need someone with the skill sets and the time to help us do that analysis and make those recommendations that are best for the organization and the community in Minot, so that we can continue to operate at a high level and in an efficient manner. And based off of that is why I made the recommendation for the creation of this position within the organization. I would also state that a lot of local governments of our size, it's not uncommon to have an assistant city manager as part of the organization for a lot of these reasons that I just outlined. In fact, many communities, probably half our size, have an assistant city manager. So I think if we're going to adapt and change to a different way of doing business and a higher, more effective way of doing business, this piece is going to be important to help us figure out how to do that.
You mentioned community survey, and I want to come back to that. But first, let's try to engage Dave a little bit so he didn't jump on in vain with us. Another thing, a theme almost, when people, I read comments or we get questions about the budget is inflation. Now, inflation hits people, it also hits us. So, Dave, as someone who's tasked with an incredibly hard job of predicting the future when you're developing a budget over a year in advance, what, how did inflation impact the development of the 2023 budget?
One of the most important things is, just trying to predict what the cost of items will be. We've seen quite an increase in not only fuel costs, like Harold had alluded to, but other items that we need to do the business that we do for cleaning streets. So salt and sand, we're forecasting some significant increases in those items, primarily due to transportation costs. Other items like cutting edges, because the cost of steel has gone up. They're extremely heavy, so the transportation cost of that, we're anticipating will be higher. But things like electricity costs, natural gas, all of these things, we're forecasting or have seen increases. So a lot of times, what we try to do is we try to conserve on the quantity to make up for some of that cost increase. In some cases, that works out for us. In other cases, it's just not possible to do that. So it's a balancing act. We're trying to project into the future what we think will happen. In some cases, almost 18 months out into the future. We're optimistic that fuel prices will correct, and we've seen some of that already. So hopefully we'll see some reduction in costs. Unfortunately, sometimes the costs rise faster than they correct and come back down. So we'll just have to play that out and see what happens. And again, we don't budget for, the uncommon events. We try to base things on historical averages as far as quantities and what we think we'll need. And again, it's an educated guess on what we think we'll need and what the price will be at some point in the future. We do contract items or put items out to bid. We're a little bit hamstrung on how we procure items and how far in the future we can procure those items. We can't enter into a contract until the funds are appropriated, so we can't go too far out into the future to lock in those costs. So that kind of ties our hands a little bit too.
In the same vein, kind of a piggyback off of that, and this could be for either of you, so just jump in with this one. When crafting the 2023 budget, given all the things you were trying to anticipate with inflation and the adjustments of costs and seeing diesel go up almost 100%, were we cognitive of that same inflation on the citizens that are dealing with that as well? How did you try to navigate that reality with this proposed budget?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, we're definitely aware of that, and it's obviously the inflation has an impact on all of our citizens, and we're definitely aware of that. I think there was a conscious effort to try to come in with a budget that was as close to flat as far as a mill rate as possible. And again, optimistic that we might find some room, or as the budget goes through the process, some of the prices will correct, or we'll have a little bit better insight on other revenue sources that can offset some property tax impacts. So, we continue to evaluate that as we move through the process. Again, we're optimistic. We may see some positive sales tax numbers come in the next month or so that'll change our projections a little bit on the sales tax revenues. That can work against us too. If we have a couple of bad months of sales tax collections, we might have to reevaluate that revenue source too.
Good point. Again, balancing what can happen in the future with what's happening in reality. I don't envy your job, Dave. Harold, let's go back to the community survey that we did, I think, about a year ago. How are the results of that used in creating this budget?
I would say they're actually pretty crucial. A lot of our recommendations and a lot of the prioritization that we made as far as what gets funded and what doesn't, a lot of that tied back to the results of the community survey. So, for example, the highest priority out of that community survey was improvement of road infrastructure. So, our recommendation included we have about $5.5 million budgeted towards road maintenance in this year's budget, the fiscal year 2022 budget that we're currently about halfway through right now. We increased that to 7.5 million for next year. Now we have a recommendation for the city engineer based off of an outside study about what we should be budgeting for maintenance in order to maintain all of our existing infrastructure and looking forward to the next 20 or so years. That estimate is we need to be closer to about $12 million a year that we should be spending just on road infrastructure alone. Now, when you have some big projects like NOD and flood mitigation infrastructure that you're trying to pay for and those kinds of things, there's always so much money to go around. But we did try to focus on, all the positions are tied either to council direction or a previous commitment that the city has already made, such as Fire Station 5, or it is tied directly to the results of the community survey. And I would say the bulk of those are all tied in that way. The only position I can think of that probably wasn't tied to any of that is that we did have one IT position that we asked for and budgeted. We're not going to get IT is more of an internal service, so we're not going to get a lot of community feedback about the needs for our IT help within the organization. But it does tie back to some of the council aspirations and goals and objectives in trying to help us adapt, become less people intensive and maybe more reliant on modern technology and software and those kinds of things. But we need IT to be able to support us be able to do that. So the community survey was very critical in that. Again, that was the factor for not only did we increase the road funding by $2 million, we also recommended adding a new engineer and engineering tech position to be able to take on the workload that comes with paying for another $2 million worth of road projects, to make sure that we could process that. And we had the workforce to be able to help us put that money to work. And then you have the outreach officer position for both police and fire to help us communicate better. Again, that ties back to the community survey. A lot of those types of things. We now, outside the general fund and talking more about enterprise funds, we did ask for a couple of positions as far as equipment operators. Some of that is to help with the maintenance of a lot of the property we're taking on with flood mitigation. We've got a lot of property we have to mow, but then during the wintertime, having that to be able to help with snow removal. That was another high priority on the community survey. How do we get more bodies to help us clear roads of snow and winter weather events more quickly and more effectively? So kind of a long-winded answer, but the community survey was critical. And then we also have money budgeted in the fiscal year 23 budget to do that survey again, because by the end of 2023, that information will be 2 years old. And so we want to update that information, update those priorities, but also we want to measure, have we had success? Have we made the right decisions with these budgetary decisions that we're starting to see movement and increased satisfaction in the areas that the citizens told us need to be a priority?
That community survey wasn't the only survey that's actually impacted the 2023 budget as well. HR had to do a 10-year salary survey for a lot of employees. That was something you mentioned when you presented this budget to council. Why is a survey like this and an increase of what I think the number was 1.4 million roughly in existing employee salary improvements? Why is something like that important, especially in the 2023 budget?
Well, as a city, we provide critical services, right? Public safety, maintenance of road infrastructure, all those kinds of things. We're an employer. We have to pay competitive rates. Minot's in a unique situation that you have some challenges that maybe some other communities don't have. I mean, everywhere across the country is having workforce issues, trying to fill positions in both in the private sector and the public sector. But here you also have the Bakken with the oil industry that pays high wages and those kinds of things. So we got to make sure that we maintain a certain level of competitiveness, both within the public sector and also against the private sector, if we're going to have the people with the skill sets and the experience that we need to provide the services that we're expected to do on a day-to-day basis. So if the hourly rate for, let's say, an entry-level police officer is only a couple dollars more or equal to, what a local fast food restaurant is paying, are you willing to be a police officer and take on all that risk and challenges if you can go work something else and not have that and make the same amount of money? So and I believe that prior to my being here, the council and the staff dealt with some of the financial pressures and the turnover issues that were coming, that the Bakken presented to this organization, and realized that we had to catch wages up if we were going to be able to hire and attract employees, but also retain employees to stay with us. We're just like any other business. Turnover is costly and expensive, and it affects service that we provide. So keeping up with that is important. So that was the intent of that study, is to make sure that we're keeping up, that we're paying competitive wages. Here a few weeks ago, I sat in a meeting with city administrators and city managers throughout the 4-state region. That'd be South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. They're all in the same boat. They're all seeing anywhere from a 4 to 7% increase in wages across the board. Again, all trying to keep up, to be able to attract staff and fill these positions that are needed.
What type of guidance, Harold and Dave, did the council give you that influenced this budget? Because it's now in their hands after it was presented to them about a week and a half ago.
Yeah, so again, back in June, we followed up the department tours of all the needs across the departments. Last year, we had a facilitator come in. We created the 4 aspirations. The council created those to help guide them and help making decisions on behalf of the community. And this year, what we did is we went through that prioritization meeting. We had them develop specific goals underneath each of those aspirations. So, and that's a graphic in the presentation that I provided the council. It's available on the city website. But there were specific goals in there with regards to aspirations. But some key issues that came from council was, let's make every dollar count. There was a directive from council that we needed to fund the replacement of equipment and vehicles before we considered the addition of new positions. There was the direction from council to try and minimize any mill levy increase as much as possible, and then to make every dollar count and get the most bang for the buck, so to speak, out of every dollar that the taxpayers have entrusted us with. So those are some of the key highlights that I took from that. In the community survey, we had some areas of service that we provide that were scored very highly, especially with our public safety. Council didn't want to give up any ground on that. They wanted to make sure that we kept that high level of satisfaction, and made that a priority, that we made sure that we had the resources available for public safety. So those are some of the key highlights that I took away from the direction from the council through this budget process.
When we talk about the ability to save money, we anticipated some increases kind of across the board, but sort of at the midnight hour after your proposed budget was submitted to council for review, but before you presented it at the city council meeting, we had some good news of health insurance premiums decreasing about 2%, if my memory serves me correctly. How do you think that potential decrease, which isn't built into your proposed budget, should impact our 2023 budget?
Dave, why don't you take a crack at that one first?
Yeah, I can take that. The city operates a self-funded insurance plan. So there's a number of components there. We fund the insurance ourselves, so we take on some risk of those claims, but then we have a stop loss coverage that protects us in the case of large claims. So it's a combination of the cost of services, our claims history, and then there's administrative cost to handling the insurance, the stop loss coverage, and then processing the claims. And we have to have some money in reserve to cover future claims as well. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Health insurance costs traditionally have been on the rise. A few years ago, we saw a very significant increase in premiums that we weren't necessarily anticipating. That put some pressure on us. It's hard to project those costs that far into the future. So usually it comes in very late in the budget process, what we think next year's premiums will be. So we took an estimate where we thought we would be for increases, and we were fortunate that we saw, believe it or not, some favorable claims history and those types of things that help to keep our rates at least stable. So we had some money built into the budget that to cover a potential increase that wasn't going to be needed.
Anything to add to that one, Harold, before we move on?
No, I agree with what Dave has said. Now, it would have been nice if we could have that information a little bit more in advance, so we're not unnecessarily building funds in, or even vice versa. If we are going to have a big increase, that we can account for that faster. But again, a lot of that's tied to claims history, and typically our insurance provider wants 6 months of claim history within that claim year to analyze for data before they can give a recommendation. And since we're on a calendar year, 6 months is June, and by the time they pull that data, get all that processed, it's usually late July before we get that information back as staff, which is pretty deep into our budget process. So again, we're kind of making an educated guess back in May and June of what that'll look like. We don't want to underestimate it, because if they come back with an 18% increase, that has a big fiscal impact. So we try to close that gap as best we can. But again, we're fortunate this year that we've had a good year, and that we're not going to see as much of an impact on health insurance as we were concerned about, which is good news. And that does provide some breathing room in there. And ultimately, that's one of the things council will have to deliberate on is what do they do with that savings, because it was built into the budget. Now it's not needed. So what's the best use of that? Should they invest it in projects? Should they use it for property tax relief? What should they do with that?
Okay. Going back to our comments here. Now, we already did public safety on Wednesday, but this one is rolling in from Miranda Heisler. I know Chief Klug is with us, so I'll let him kind of answer this one. The question is, and I'll rephrase it a little bit, that Miranda's asking is there a way to maybe add more funding for animal control officers, or is this something that Chief Klug, you see, needs to be more funded going into the future?
Yeah, so I think as it stands right now, I think we have a good level of coverage in Minot for animals. I think we can always do things a little bit better, but most of our calls come, during the morning and daytime hours. And those calls that come in after hours, we do have officers that are working that have access to the tools that the ACOs use, and if absolutely necessary, we can have officers respond and take care of those. It could come to the point where we need to potentially add more money to our animal control area, but as of now, I think it's adequately covered.
All right, thanks, Chief. Thanks for being ready on the fly. No one even knew you were here. You just snuck in there from the top rope to answer that one. I appreciate that, Chief. Okay, I have one more. Unless we get more rolling in through the comment section, we have just a little bit of time left on our 45 minutes. So this one's a little bit more of a global question for you, Harold. As the city manager, this budget that we're working off of right now has your name on it. It is the city manager's proposed budget. Now that may change because the council has their chance to go through this. But what is one thing that you want the community to take away from your 2023 budget?
I think the big thing I would want the public to take away from this budget is that we are trying to engage the public in new and different ways, and we are listening to what the public is telling us is a need and a priority. So participation in the community survey is important because, as we talked about earlier in this in this conversation, that's had a lot of weight in a lot of the prioritization and where we're choosing to invest money to improve services and build a better, stronger community. I think the other message that I think the public needs to understand is we're underneath a lot of the same financial pressures and challenges that businesses and individual citizens are. Cost of everything for us is going up. But I think one of the differences is that we provide services that everybody in the community depends on, and that contribute significantly to the health and the quality and the strength of our community. Reduction in funding for those types of things, the more expensive things get. If we hold taxes where they are, that means that we have to figure out how to do more with less, because that money doesn't go as far. It doesn't buy as much. It doesn't buy as much as far as employees to work or equipment or those kinds of things. And we're trying to balance all of that. Now, that being said, we are mindful and cognizant that our decisions have a direct impact on the financial viability of our citizens, right? I live in Minot. I pay city property taxes too, and I've got to figure out how to balance my budget at home as well. And so I'm not necessarily in a hurry to go solve all our problems by just simply raising property tax or raising the tax burden. If you also paid attention to my presentation, I also presented some other options of potential revenue generation that wouldn't necessarily have to be based off of property tax. I talked about, we could begin a conversation about another 1 cent on the sales tax or some increment of that going forward. Not everything has to be solved through property tax. We had the earlier conversation about, do we look at reductions? Yes, we do look at reductions. We look at ways, how do we be more efficient? How can we adapt and change and provide the same level of service without increasing cost? Those are all things that we look at. But at the end of the day, we do have certain challenges and we have certain expectations that the community has for us and services that we provide that we need to continue to do.
All right, thank you. I think we have a few more coming in here. This one I don't know much about. Hopefully someone can answer this. If not, we'll try to work up an answer and respond to this person individually. Is there an increase in unemployment compensation? That seems to be one question from Facebook users. Dave, I'm not sure if you can take this one or not.
I'll take a stab at it here. The way we play unemployment as a municipal government is different than the way private employers pay unemployment. So again, that's an estimate based on prior claims and what our payroll is and what the anticipation is. So our unemployment is a relatively low dollar amount. So if there's any increase in that at all, it comes across as a very large percentage. So that's primarily it. Any unemployment claims that may have been a result of COVID or anything like that in prior years would have affected our budget numbers for the upcoming year. Those estimates are based on historical information.
Yeah, it's easy to look at percentage increase and get jarred by triple digits, but you don't know if that's going from $10 to $30 or how that's working. So, okay, I am out. I don't see any more questions rolling in for you guys at the moment. Now's a chance to maybe say something that you wanted to say about the 2023 budget regarding general government, which is kind of all of the intangible positions and departments that the city operates. Anything else, gentlemen?
Just a couple of things, Derek, just to highlight some of what Harold had said earlier, and how we approach the budget preparation. And we try to look as far into the future and, be as proactive as we can in forecasting things that are going to happen in the future and balance that with the anticipation and the needs of the citizens and what they expect. Just a couple of highlights. Last year, the 2022 budget, we took a best guess at what we thought we needed to budget for snow removal. Things went pretty well early in the winter, and all of a sudden we get a huge snowstorm in April. And we've used about 87% of our overtime budget in the street department, 90+% of our fuel budget. We're over budget on sand and salt. All of these types of things. 82% of our cutting edge budget. 97% of diesel fuel. So it just an extraordinary event like that can have a tremendous impact on our budget. So we have to be we try to be conservative, but we have to be realistic in the preparation of the budget. That snowstorm happened late in April. We know that it's going to melt in a relatively short period of time, but that's not the expectation that our citizens have. They wanted the streets clear. They want to be able to get back to business, and rightfully so. So we have to prepare the budget to be responsible so we can take care of those things as they happen.
And one thing that's, you see this a lot. We do by law have to have a balanced budget, Dave. Sometimes you see people wanting us to balance that budget better, but when it comes down to the end of it, it's zeros on the ticker, right? Can you maybe talk about how you're required to balance the budget as a local government?
Yeah, and that's correct. I mean, we have to have the funding in place to appropriate the money, and that can come from a revenue stream, a current revenue stream, or it can come from money that is in reserves in the bank. So again, it's a balancing act. We try to be as accurate as we can in forecasting those revenue streams. We utilize reserves that are available. We try to be conservative with the use of those. We try to project our expenditures into the future and save up for big costs. Some of the equipment that we buy is $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. So we try to put some money away every year in the budget to save up for those large purchases, so that we don't have such an impact all in one year. Sometimes we do leases to help spread out that cost too, to level out our budget. And we try to be as consistent as we can, so we don't have this constant ebb and flow. So all of a sudden one year you get a huge increase, and then maybe next year it goes down, and then we go back up. It seems like it's a lot more palatable if we can stay somewhat consistent with that and take out some of those highs and lows.
Yeah, you can't really get a fire engine on eBay nowadays, at least not one that you're going to want to operate. So planning for that in advance is really helpful. Okay, gentlemen, anything else for the good of the order for the people before we wrap up on our second Ask Me Anything regarding the 2023 budget?
Yeah, just me real quick. I just want to thank the public for engaging on this. This is a new format, so I definitely appreciate people coming in and asking questions. But I also want to say that this isn't a substitute for like a public hearing and participation at a public council meeting. So like we've had the questions today about the animal control officers and those kinds of things. So if those are things of a priority, that you still have an opportunity to come and engage with the council, either through email or phone call, or even coming to a city council meeting coming up. And so definitely encourage the public to still do that. The purpose of this is to help people be informed and understand, so that way they can determine how they want to respond and engage in making sure that we're approving a budget that is representative of the public and its priorities and its needs. So again, just thank you to everyone for participating. Hopefully these are helpful. We do have another one next week, and hopefully there'll also be one with Council President Pittner, because he'll be presenting his recommended budget to the council Monday night as well. So that'll be another one for the public to tune in on and then engage, respond. We do want to hear from you. It does matter. And I'm appreciative of those that do engage.
Perfect way to segue into our outro here, Harold. Thanks again, Dave. Thanks for taking our time. We have several staff members that are in the bullpen waiting just in case that their number is called. I appreciate all their time as well. As Harold mentioned, we have another one of these coming up on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. This one is all about public works and street. We'll probably dive into that increase on our street maintenance budget. Tune in for that. Submit your questions in advance if you can. That's minetnd.org/mailbag. We'll do our best to answer everything we can there. This isn't a replacement for public hearings. We'll still have that entire process as well, and we'll schedule a conversation with President Pittner as well when he gets his budget submitted, and we can have more conversations regarding that. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks, gentlemen, for making some time. We'll talk again on Tuesday.